You'll hear me sometimes say embrace suffering. I don't mean embrace it like it's enjoyable or good, but I mean name it honestly, to name it. Refusing to let it define you, that I'm more than just what I've suffered. Inviting God into it, looking for meaning in it, not just relief, and walking in community with that. Those would be the things that I would mean by embracing suffering. What do you get out of embracing suffering? You have deeper empathy for others. You have greater intimacy with God. You have stronger character and resilience. And you tend to be more authentic and have a more grounded faith because you've faced the struggles. But that kind of brings us to a theology of suffering, or a theology of what does God say about all this stuff? And I would suggest that rather than something to be avoided at all costs, suffering is often portrayed in the Bible as formative. God says that it shapes our character. Sometimes the Bible would suggest that suffering is participatory. It's a way of sharing with the suffering of Christ, Philippians 3:10. There's even an idea that suffering is missional, and the idea it's a witness to the world of sustaining grace. You can find that if you look at 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 10. And the other thing that the Bible would teach about suffering is it's temporary. It's a present reality that one day will give way to glory, and that would be found in Romans 8:18. And so biblically, suffering is formative, participatory, missional, and temporary. And those are kind of biblical, a biblical framework. It doesn't make suffering easy. It's not a spiritual bypass, but it is a way to understand that suffering is not how the story of God ends. I think one of the things I think about when I think about suffering is the big story and the little story. The little story is a story that I live. But I think God would say that our little story is connected to his larger story of redemption. There's something about realizing that your suffering is not where the story ends, and your suffering isn't the thing that defines you. But if there's not conflict, if there's not suffering, if there's not difficulty in the story, there's nothing compelling about the story. I was talking to some Christian filmmakers this past week, and they were telling me that they were going to try to make a movie about addiction, and they said, but the problem is they've had trouble getting funding because they want to make it a story that is difficult and has sorrow in it, and that the actor continues to struggle with their cravings, and that some of the Christian the money that helps produce those sort of films, they said no one wants to fund the film because it doesn't take a small hard story and use the sorrow and use the struggle and doesn't fully resolve that struggle, but it just kind of points it to the bigger story. And a lot of times we don't want to hear a story that has conflict in it, but all good stories have conflict. That's the anatomy of every good story. You've got someone who wants something and they have to go through something difficult to get it. And that's what shapes us. That's what makes us. That's what grows us. And a lot of times we try to avoid the very things that are going to make us what we're supposed to be. In parenting, again, you don't need to put obstacles in front of kids. Sometimes we so protect our children from any struggle at all that they don't grow and they don't have resilience. The old preacher story about the little boy who found a cocoon for a butterfly, and he saw the butterfly trying to get out, and so he opened the cocoon himself for the butterfly to come out, and the butterfly couldn't fly because what makes the wings strong is the fighting through the cocoon to get out. And so sometimes we miss that in the Christian world. We only want good, quick stories that are easily resolved in a few minutes and they don't have ongoing struggle with them or don't have any consequences. And so small stories are part of God's bigger story, and God's bigger story ultimately is about redemption, but it's not an easy story. So what does Scripture teach about suffering? Suffering refines faith. You'll see that in 1 Peter. All of 1 Peter is about suffering. The entire book is a book on suffering. The context of 1 Peter is that the early church was starting to be persecuted, and he was writing to them. And one of his themes will be that suffering refines faith. Suffering produces endurance. You'll find that in Romans 5. It gives you a progression in Romans 5 of perseverance, character, and hope. And all that comes from suffering. You see, the beauty of the Christian faith is that we have a suffering that ultimately can produce hope because we're not alone in it and there's meaning to it. Suffering unites us with Christ, the Bible would teach. In Philippians, where it says we have a fellowship with his sufferings, or when Paul says in Romans that you join in his suffering, you join in his glory, but also in his suffering. Suffering reveals the power of God. Paul learns that God's power is made perfect in weakness in 2 Corinthians when he was talking about all the things that had happened to him. Scripture will reveal the role of suffering as it refines our faith. It produces endurance. It unites us with Christ, and it reveals God's power. I think the fascinating thing is we just skip over this in the Bible. If you were to say to most people, what's the book of Genesis about? They'd say creation. And the creation story is about 4 or 5 chapters. But the story of Joseph is about 16 chapters. And what you find in the story of Joseph is a story of a man who it's almost this bipolar. It's good. He's favored by his father. It's bad. It made the brothers jealous. And eventually they sold him to slavery. Oh, that's bad. Oh, no, it's good because there's this roller coaster of a life that is full of sorrow, full of disappointment. We just skip over it, but there's incredible disappointment for Joseph in this. And then finally, the story ends, and he says this interesting phrase, and again, this is in the very first book of the Bible. God is setting us up to see that this is how he works. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good, so many could be saved. That is God's message to us, is that we're not alone in our suffering. He doesn't take our sufferings lightly, but he will use it for good purposes so that many could be saved. I think suffering that sanctifies leads to a deeper dependence on God. Suffering that sanctifies produces humility, compassion, and empathy, and maybe even maturity. Suffering that sanctifies is processed in community, and it brings the community of believers closer together. And ultimately, sanctified suffering produces the fruits of the Spirit. Suffering that doesn't, it tends to be isolated, hidden, and denied. It leads to bitterness, despair, self-contempt. It's not brought into the light so it can have purpose. It's hidden. It often stems from abuse and injustice. And we're made by God to hate injustice because God is a just and holy God, and we're created in his image. And even though we've been tainted by sin, there is something in us that knows when we've been wronged or something's been unjust. And we're supposed to be angry at injustice. But everything, biblically speaking, even evil, can be used somehow in God's bigger story. And you won't always understand that. I won't always understand that, but it's possible.